Hello, my fellow oddities, and welcome to Beyond the Krypt, the retrospective series where we look through the archives of Mortal Kombat history. Today, we will see how two brothers with the power to control ice became Mortal Kombat mainstays. I am, of course, talking about the legendary assassin of the Lin Kuei, Bi-Han and Kuai Liang, both better known as Sub-Zero. We will be going through each game they make an appearance in, reviewing the changes made to their character and how it impacted them going forward, good or bad. I will also be handing out letter grades to each game's version of Sub-Zero to show how I feel about how the character was handled overall in that particular game. So without further ado, let's start from the beginning. The idea for Sub-Zero actually originated before the more popular Scorpion. Mortal Kombat co-creator John Tobias was researching Asian mythology and martial arts history when he found two books, China's Ninja Heritage and Combat Skills of the Lin Kuei. These books mentioned a mythical ancient Chinese clan of assassins called the Lin Kuei, who would go on to inspire the traditional Japanese ninjas we know of today, which is what Scorpion is. Tobias envisioned a mysterious, ninja-like character from this Lin Kuei, and that would be the beginnings of Sub-Zero, with the idea eventually splitting into two ninja characters, a hunter and a hunted, with the original concept being a fleeing Lin Kuei warrior being chased down by a clan member, which would inspire Takeda, the founder of the Shiryu, and his story of escaping the Lin Kuei to create his new clan. But as for the characters we got in the final game, the narrative would evolve into a story of revenge, with Scorpion hunting down the Lin Kuei member for taking the lives of his wife and child. But let's halt on that and save more story talk for later. Fun fact, before being called Sub-Zero in the final game, his original name was Tundra. Remember that for later. It's going to be important. It's actually believed by a lot of fans that John Tobias' favorite character is Sub-Zero, which would be fitting seeing as the other co-creator of Mortal Kombat, Ed Boon, has gone on record multiple times saying his favorite character is Scorpion, though it's never been said outright by John Tobias himself. The costume used for Sub-Zero and Scorpion was store-bought, and originally yellow, despite some people thinking it was red, and Sub-Zero's color was digitally altered to be blue in-game. Daniel Pacino was the actor that played both Sub-Zero and Scorpion, performing all of the punches, kicks, stances, and special moves. In the original Mortal Kombat, the gameplay was not nearly as in-depth as it is today, so that makes ranking the characters based on who's the best and worst very different. In the original Mortal Kombat, it was a bit more of a chess match rather than the super fast-paced, high-pressure action. But for Sub, I'm going to be calling him Sub a lot in this video, just easier to say, it's generally agreed upon that he is one of the weaker characters in the game, along with Scorpion. Their normals are all identical since they're palette swaps, so special moves are the only thing that separates the two ninjas. And Sub-Zero's special moves gave him a big edge over Scorpion, whose spear was terrible and whose teleport was just okay. Sub, on the other hand, had his character-defining, iconic freeze move and his fantastic slide, which was quick on startup, hit low, and knocked opponents into the air. Sub was also great in the corner, mostly because of this slide attack. However, it was hard for him to set up the situation needed for someone to get into that position, which is why he isn't higher on the tier list, but for many people, he is. And then, of course, the fatalities, which made Mortal Kombat as popular as it is today. And if there's one thing you can choose for Sub-Zero to have over Scorpion, it's that he has the most iconic and influential fatality of all time. The spine rip, where he grabs the opponent's head and tears it off with the spinal cord still attached, was pretty much the point of contention in the 90s with the controversy surrounding violence in video games. Was this too far? It's funny because this doesn't really show much character at all. He doesn't even use his ice powers, it's just a Predator reference slapped on a sub. I'm not complaining or anything, but it's just interesting to compare it to a character like Scorpion, whose fatality, despite not being as well known or influential, is so much more specific to him. When it comes to story, in the original Mortal Kombat, we hardly knew anything about Sub at all, not even the name Bi-Han. We just knew that he was a warrior from the Lin Kuei, sent on a mission to kill the host of the Mortal Kombat tournament, Shang Tsung, and that he also murdered Scorpion before the events of the game. In his ending, which ended up being non-canon, he completes his mission of killing Shang Tsung and actually retires, this was the first hint towards Sub-Zero not being the heartless killer many believe him to be in this first game, and that he really only killed because of 1, the money, and 2, because it was all he knew. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. After the game's release, despite being the first concept Ninja created for the game and having the most iconic fatality, it wouldn't be Sub-Zero, but actually Scorpion, who became the superstar of the franchise. And for a long time, probably up until the last 10 or so years, Sub-Zero was always known as the Luigi to Scorpion's Mario, a second fiddle that would always be in the shadow of his more popular counterpart. But at least Mario actually came first. As I said in the Scorpion retrospective, I believe this is down to how much character is shown within the limited resources of the time. There was no cinematic story, so they had to show personalities through other methods, and while both characters were very mysterious, Scorpion had the "get over here" line, he had the more interesting bio, and the fatality that did show more of his character. Whereas people really didn't know Sub-Zero, his personality, or his character from what was shown in the game. And that'll do it for Sub-Zero from the original Mortal Kombat. Unlike Scorpion, this original version didn't really get the chance to evolve linearly and clearly over multiple games, which is disappointing since this was a very strong base for a great character with a lot of potential, which never really got tapped into the way the next version of the character did. I'd give the original Sub-Zero a B+. Sub-Zero would return, of course, for the sequel, Mortal Kombat 2. But this is not the same Sub-Zero we met in that original game, and I think the changes made to his design did a lot to showcase that change in personality. He has a tighter hood, a quilted texture on the vest, and bigger shin guards. The lighting and shade of blue has been slightly altered to the point where you guys might think I'm insane, but it does a lot for me to make it look like a new, more compassionate character. Just like with Scorpion, in-game, the mask used for Sub is the cloth one from the first game, but in more high-quality images and renders, the mask is made from the bottom half of a paintball mask painted blue. MK2 Sub-Zero was not great competitively, generally being considered bottom 3. It wasn't even necessarily that he had terrible mechanics. In concept, his toolkit was actually pretty decent. The ice ball, the slide, the new ground freeze attack, which stuns the opponent in place for a combo, almost like a low-hitting version of the ice ball. However, these moves and his toolkit were held back by long startup times, being unsafe, and none of them being particularly damaging. In fact, his ice ball and ground freeze don't do any damage if you don't follow up, making his slide the only damaging special move he has, and in a game with no combos, that's really bad. So often, if your opponent got into the lead, you'd pretty much be screwed because he can't mount enough of an offense to get back into the fight. Sub-Zero receives 2 new fatalities in Mortal Kombat 2. The first one actually has a unique input, with you having to freeze the opponent first, then Sub-Zero uppercuts them and they explode into 15 unidentifiable limbs, 8 intestines, and at least 5 rib cages. His second fatality has him shoot an ice ball into the opponent's heart, making them explode. Okay. To be honest, these fatalities are really lame. Sub has always struggled to have cool fatals compared to Scorpion, and definitely nothing as memorable as the initial spine rip, which interestingly enough did not return in this game, probably because this is Kuai Liang and not Bi-Han. Speaking of which, in Mortal Kombat 2, we find out that Scorpion killed the original Sub-Zero during the aftermath of the first tournament. Sub-Zero would then mysteriously return in this second tournament to complete the mission his brother started in assassinating Shang Tsung. In his ending, it's revealed that this Sub-Zero was actually the younger brother of the first. Despite this, he has no real rivalry with Scorpion and doesn't seem to care about his brother's death or getting vengeance, which would change in later retellings and adaptations. Scorpion would even become a sort of guardian for Sub-Zero after seeing him spare an opponent and feeling guilty about killing his brother. This sparing would also show that this Sub-Zero is different from the first in not being the cold-hearted killer. MK2 Sub-Zero is a great introduction to the character we'll be following for most of this retrospective. Does it suck that Bi-Han's potential as a character kinda gets thrown out? Yeah, but Kuai has proved over time to be a great character as well, and this game set the groundwork very well, seeing as he hasn't fundamentally changed much until this most recent game. But I will say that the games that have come since do a lot more interesting things when it comes to stories, since he doesn't really do much in this game. So I'll give MK2 Sub an A-. In Mortal Kombat 3, none of the classic ninjas that were the standout characters of the previous two games made their return, except for one, Sub-Zero. The reason for this is that Sub was no longer a ninja, or assassin, because the Lin Kuei aren't ninjas, but you get what I mean. And you can see that with his new design, which is much more WWE wrestler or superhero inspired rather than ninja. You see much more of his muscles, the overall suit is much more skin tight, the colors are more saturated, and of course, he is maskless, now played by John Turk, since at this point Daniel Pesina, who had played him in the previous two games, had been fired. John Turk has become synonymous with playing Sub-Zero, most notably in Mythologies, which we'll cover later. And yes, that is his actual jawline. How? You can really tell how much more westernized the MK3 designs became with this one, and I'm not a fan. I just think it looks really lame and doesn't have the edge that the more ninja-inspired designs have, or that the re-adaptations of this design have also had. Though this is the first appearance of his iconic scar, which has been a part of every Kuai Liang design besides for MK9. It looks a little silly here, but it stuck around and became pivotal to any Kuai design. MK3 marked when the series became a little bit more advanced when it came to gameplay. And you want to know something else that advanced? Sub's place on the tier list, and it's all because of one move, the Ice Clone. This is now an iconic mainstay of Sub's toolkit, and it hasn't gotten any better than it is in this game. You could use the Ice Ball and his new Ice Shower move to zone your opponent out, and then when you want to do some damage, casually use the Ice Clone over and over again to constantly reset your opponent mid-air so you can continue juggling them just to Ice Clone again, and then repeat. This means Sub and MK3 had 100% combos. Were they easy to do? Relatively, yeah. It's not like you had to enter a ridiculous amount of inputs at lightning speed. It was pretty simple to just spam the Ice Clone in the corner. He barely even used the new built-in combo system MK3 had. Sub-Zero once again gets two completely new fatalities in this game. The first one has him freeze the opponent over his head and then pulls them apart so that they shatter on the ground. The second one has him blow cold air at the opponent, both freezing them and tipping them over, and they shatter on the floor. But yeah, again, there's not really much spice on these fatalities, and they're pretty forgettable. Sub-Zero also has one of the very few animalities in this game that actually makes sense, with him turning into a polar bear and mauling the opponent. Sub gets a big upgrade in MK3's story, getting a super cool narrative of him being on the run from the Lin Kuei, who have now required all their members to be cyberized. Sub, along with his friend Smoke, try to escape this fate, with Smoke being captured and turned, and Sub being scarred by the two cyborgs sent after them, Sector and Cyrax. And while he's being hunted, Shao Kahn comes out and starts his invasion of Earthrealm, so Sub joins the fight as part of the Defenders of the Realm. In his ending, he rescues Smoke from his programmed brainwashing, and with his help, defeats Cyrax and Sector. He even reprograms Cyrax to kill Shao Kahn, which he is obviously unsuccessful in doing, and Smoke, despite being rescued, then gets captured by Shao Kahn's forces. Overall, MK3 Sub stumbles just in the design aspect, in my opinion. Everything else is great and a big step up from MK2. His gameplay is fun with a new Ice Clone, and he's one of the best in the game. And his story is great too, and defined a lot of what Kuai's journey would be throughout the series. I'll give MK3 Sub an A. Then there was Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, and Kuai himself stays pretty much the same, but we also got a classic Sub-Zero in the traditional UMK3 ninja outfit, and this is supposed to be the original Sub-Zero, Bi-Han. This design is one I've talked about so much. I don't like the UMK3 ninja designs because of how superhero-y they look. The skin-tight outfit, the fake-looking vest and armor, and the bright highlighter colors. This is no exception, and it definitely doesn't feel like something Bi-Han would wear. Competitively, the unmasked Sub-Zero from the original MK3 is now about mid-tier, with the classic Sub-Zero being low-tier. You might be wondering, how does one go from one of the best in the game to mid and low tier? Well, in UMK3, the ninjas had a much larger hitbox than the rest of the cast. This included both unmasked and especially classic Sub-Zero. This meant that certain combos would just be able to absolutely decimate these guys, and they didn't have the firepower to return back with anything. Remember, Sub-Zero has always been a pretty low damage character, and that was made up for in base MK3 but UMK3 is a whole different ballgame. Also, Unmasked Sub-Zero's ice clone no longer worked from a very close range, meaning you couldn't do the crazy combinations in the corner that led to 100% damage. And Classic Sub was just even worse. Everything about him besides his normals were terrible, and he only had MK2 Sub's moveset, and this is UMK3, so that just isn't going to work. The Classic Sub-Zero does get a new fatality in the form of the Spine Rip, and all of its not glory, because they make the decision to censor it. Not sure why. When it comes to story, Classic Sub-Zero isn't canon, and there are no updates to Unmasked Sub-Zero, so nothing to say there. So for UMK3 Sub, I mean, you get both Bi-Han and Kuai, which is nice, but it doesn't really add anything of any substance to the overall character's legacy. I'll give them a C. Both Sub-Zeros would return for Trilogy, and while Unmasked Sub-Zero is completely unchanged, Classic Sub-Zero does get a few additions, such as a new fatality where he uppercuts the opponent and then creates an ice spike that they fall onto. See, whenever Bi-Han has a fatality, it's just more saucy than Kuai. On the N64 port, Classic Sub-Zero was a lot better, generally being considered top tier. This was because they brought in all of the moves from the Unmasked Sub-Zero, the Ice Shower, and the Ice Clone, and brought it over to Classic Sub-Zero, which, combined with the benefits that the ninjas had in Trilogy, made for a big improvement. But that's just a port, so this time they get a C-. This is the big one. Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero. You can probably tell by the title, we got a lot here. And we're back to Bi-Han. Cherish this, because this was the last time he was the main Sub-Zero in a game until almost 30 years later. Sub's design in this game is pretty basic stuff. You got the vest, the shin guards, the arm guards, the mask, a nice dark shade of blue, fitting for Bi-Han. Just a basic, solid design. Gameplay. I tried to stream this game, and it nearly killed me. The controls are whack. They try to replicate the MK fighting game movement and controls over to a platformer, and it just doesn't work. I was getting bodied by regular enemies, and I fought Fujin like 50 times, and when I finally beat him, the game insta-killed me without telling me what to do. What? I quit at that point. Screw this game and its stupid controls. The inputs for the special moves are too complicated and they don't work. And the special moves, by the way, he doesn't really get anything too new or interesting here. It's just pretty basic Sub-Zero stuff. Then we have story. Strap in. Firstly, the Mortal Kombat Mythologies website gave us a lot more information on both the Sub-Zero's backstories. They were born in America to a white mother and Chinese father, who was secretly with the Lin Kuei. They also had a sister who is no one. She's not important. Or is she? No, she's not important. When old enough, the father came to take them away to the Lin Kuei, despite their mother's best efforts to hide them and live a normal life. At the Lin Kuei, they were trained harshly to become cold-hearted assassins and embrace their cryomancy abilities. The actual game begins with Bi-Han invading a Shaolin temple. He defeats a bunch of monks who melt into the floor for some reason. And eventually, after many very annoying traps, he encounters Hanzo Hasashi. They battle and Sub wins, ripping out his spine just like his iconic fatality. He then takes the Map of Elements, which leads to the Temple of Elements. Then we get the first cutscene of the game, where Sub-Zero is played by and voiced for the first time by John Turk. These cutscenes are probably the most iconic thing about the game. I like this one since Quan Chi called Sub-Zero the N-word.
I see the ninja has been successful in retrieving my map, as I have foreseen.
Let's get something straight. I am not a ninja. I am Lin Kuei.
Anyways, in this scene, it's revealed that Quan Chi killed Hanzo's clan as a reward for Sub-Zero completing the mission, which the Lin Kuei Grandmaster is very happy with. So he sends Sub to do another mission for Quan, invade the Temple of Elements, kill the 4 elemental gods guarding it, and then take Shinnok's amulet. But they don't know Shinnok's gonna murder everyone since Quan Chi conveniently doesn't mention it. So we follow Sub as he climbs the Himalayan mountains and gets to the Temple of Elements. First, he does some very frustrating platforming up in the sky, eventually getting to the god of wind, Fujin. Yes, that Fujin. They fight and Sub-Zero wins. How does he defeat a god? Because he's just that awesome. And Fujin explodes. This pattern reoccurs with the next 3 elemental gods, the Earth God, the Water God, and the Fire God. They don't get names because they're not important. Sub-Zero does eventually get to the Amulet of Shinnok, and Quan Chi appears to take it. Raiden then appears and is like, yeah, you done messed up, buddy. So Raiden teleports Sub to the Netherrealm, where he is to take the amulet back from Quan Chi and Shinnok. Sub first appears in the Prison of Souls, where he encounters Hanzo Asashi once again, now Scorpion. They fight, and because Sub-Zero's name is in the title of the game, he wins. Sub continues through the Netherrealm, fighting dinosaurs and mechs before getting to Shinnok's fortress. There, he fights Kia, murders her, Jataka, murders her, and Serena, who he spares. Why? Well, I like to think that it's because he sees a part of himself within her. Someone who their whole life has only known killing and working for someone that doesn't really care for them. He sees her potential and gives her a chance to do better because, deep down, he knows his own potential and he hopes to one day have a chance to do better himself. Or it's because she's hot, and honestly, don't blame him. Sub finally confronts Quan Chi, and he learns that the reason he's able to exist in the Netherrealm is because of the darkness within his heart, because any normal mortal wouldn't handle the evilness. And we get the sense that this is something that bothers Bi-Han. And with the help of Serena, he defeats Quan Chi, and damn, bro is on a generational run. Scorpion twice, 4 elemental gods, and Quan Chi. Anyways, Serena dies and Sub battles Shinnok, taking the amulet back to the Temple of Elements and Raiden. Here, Sub asks Raiden if it's true that only people with darkness in their souls can exist in the Netherrealm. Raiden says it is true, but he can still choose his own destiny. A lot of people think that Bi-Han is heartless and evil, even NRS. But in the original timeline, he was more of a morally gray character who wanted to do the right thing, but was constantly bound by his loyalty to the Lin Kuei. And that does it for MK Mythologies. The only thing that really lets this version of the character down is how horrendous the gameplay is, keeping him from being S ranked. But the other stuff is so good that I can't give him anything below an A. Then, MK made the jump to 3D with Mortal Kombat 4, ditching the digitized actors for rough 3D models. As I said in the last one of these, I honestly think they look worse. As for the design itself, it's the exact same as the Mythologies one, but with the scars since we're back to covering Kuai Liang. MK4 Sub was actually pretty solid, being an example of the defensive, low damage style that is actually quite effective. His ice clone is great once again, though now with sidestepping and the removal of certain ice moves, is a little less dominant than in MK3. And he was a great keep away character with effective zoning and a good ability to get out of dodgy situations. MK4 also introduced weapon combat, giving Sub not the Corey blade that he would go on to be known for, but instead an ice scepter, which sounds really cool in concept, but in game, I don't know what that is. Is it a sword? No. Is it a hammer? No. Not a staff. Just not any weapon I've seen before. As for the Fatals, both are recreations, with the first being the Spine Rip, which doesn't really follow the philosophy of that being Bi-Han's finisher, but there's no way they weren't going to have the most iconic fatality not carry over into the new 3D landscape. The other is the one from MK2 where he freezes the opponent and then uppercuts them into an explosion of blood and guts. In MK4, Sub is a lot less interesting because he's mostly a pawn in Scorpion's story rather than his own character, but there are a few things I'd like to note. Since this game was developed around the same time of and released the same year as MK Mythologies, a lot of story elements cross over, mainly with Sub-Zero. It's seen in the canon MK4 comic that Kuai uses the information told to him about Shinnok and the Temple of Elements by his brother, and it's seen that he puts on his brother's mask once again, as he did in MK2, as a sort of way to represent him, as well as re-jog his memories of the stories Bi-Han told. After this, Sub's help would be reached out to by Raiden, and he would assist in the battle against Shinnok, until Scorpion comes through and absolutely wrecks him. Remember earlier when I said Scorpion acted as a sort of guardian for this younger Sub-Zero? Well, now he's pissed because Quan Chi has told him that Kuai Liang was the one that killed off his family and not Bi-Han. After defeating Sub, Scorpion is told the truth by Quan Chi himself that he was the one who killed his family, leading to Scorpion dragging Quan Chi to hell while Sub puts some ice on his wounds. Get it? Get it? Wrapping up with MK4 Sub, everything about him is serviceable. He's not particularly special, and it was kind of an in-between era for him with his great story in MK3 and his great story in the 3D era. The real 3D era. Overall, I'm giving MK4 Sub a B. Then we have Deadly Alliance, which released 5 years after MK4, which I believe is the longest gap between mainline games ever, and you can really tell. The graphical leap was astronomical, and the character models looked better than ever. And all the designs were modernized with extra details, intricate patterns, and armor, which did run the risk of overcomplicating things, but they did well in making sure the essence of all the characters remained there, and they were still recognizable. Deadly Alliance had a decent deal of good designs, but unfortunately, Sub's default is not one of them. It takes after MK3, modernizing it, which isn't my favorite choice, but doesn't necessarily look bad. Plus, they introduced the Ice Arms and Blue Scar, which are some of my favorite design choices for the character. But he's old. Now, there is an explanation for this. The Dragon Medallion, which we'll talk more about later, made him age rapidly, but it still doesn't look good. And it's a shame because his alternate is really good, one of my favorite Sub designs, and it really should have been the default. I mean, there's a reason it's the one that made a return in MK1. Weapons return in MK Deadly Alliance, with Sub-Zero getting his iconic Quarry Blade, a giant ice sword. Doesn't get much cooler than that. Sorry. MK Deadly Alliance also gave every character 2 fighting stances along with the weapon, and Sub got Shotokan and Dragon. And they weren't great, along with Sub-Zero as a whole. I see Sub in this game, ironically, as the opposite of Scorpion in this game. Mix-up beast, terrible at mix-ups. Overwhelming amounts of different options and playstyles to work with within the game's meta. Damn near nothing. He would get a few new moves, the Ice Shaker where he summons ice around his body, freezing close opponents, and the Slide is now the Cold Shoulder where he rams into the opponent, but it just wasn't enough to save him from the likes of Draman and Boraicho. Deadly Alliance would only give out 1 fatality per character like in the very first game, and Sub would get the ultimate upgrade to the Spine Rip fatality, now not just ripping out your spine, but your whole skeleton. I don't really like this one that much. It's just a bit too silly for me, and it's too similar to Kano's MK3 fatality. After MK4, Sub-Zero decides to confront Sector and his cyberized Lin Kuei. He defeats Sector and is now in possession of the Dragon Medallion, taking back control of the Lin Kuei. But he has to rebuild from the ground up since there are no uncyberized Lin Kuei left. He's able to do this now with the enhanced powers given to him by the Dragon Medallion. He finds an ice temple deep within the Arctic where he would recruit warriors to be part of his new Lin Kuei, with his primary pupil being the only other cryomancer in Earthrealm with his brother dead, Frost. When he started training her, Frost was, ironically, hot-headed and lacking control over her abilities. While he was able to hone her powers and help her control them, he was unable to get through to her as a person, with an inherent rebellious nature to her soul. So would be recruited by Raiden to help stop the Deadly Alliance, who had become a significant threat to Earthrealm, killing Liu Kang and Shao Kahn. Sub would agree, seeing it as a chance for the world to see the Lin Kuei change for the better, and he would travel to Outworld with Frost by his side. This would end up being a very big mistake, as during this journey in Outworld, Frost would turn on Sub-Zero, stealing the Dragon Medallion for herself. But she could not contain the power, and she lost control over her abilities, freezing herself solid. And even though you might be wondering what happens next, we're gonna have to cut it off there for Deadly Alliance. This is a great version of the character, and even though we're not quite there yet, you can definitely feel the character starting to peak, especially in terms of story. But he is low tier and the default isn't great, so that keeps him from being really up there. I'll give Deadly Alliance sub a B+. Now we have Deception. Sub is arguably one of the faces of this game along with Onaga. When you think of Deception, you often think of Sub's new design, and why don't we get straight into talking about that great new design. The Shredder outfit with the headgear, fur hood, pale white skin, white eyes, the shoulder armor, the big dragon face on his belt. This is an awesome design, and one of the few across the series with an actual story reason to exist. After Frost does her oopsie, Sub wanders with her body around Outworld, eventually finding the catacombs once inhabited by the lost race of cryomancers, his ancestors that eventually made their way into Earthrealm. Here, he would lay Frost's body to rest in a sarcophagus and steal the armor of one of those ancient cryomancers. As for his alternate, the less we talk about that one, the better. The near unanimous bottom 3 of Deception's tier list goes Li Mei, Sub-Zero, and then Kira. I think that tells you all you need to know. But yeah, it's mostly the same things that have plagued this character from the very beginning. The low damage, the long startups on the Ice Ball and Cold Shoulder. His Ice Clone does return, but it's not the deadly weapon needed to be effective since his offense is so bad. We're back to 2 fatalities per character, and the first one has him freeze the opponent, rip their head off, and then fastball their head into their frozen body, making it explode. The second one has him freeze the opponent's legs, sweep them, and then stomp on their chest so hard their head pops off. Damn. Sub-Zero would also receive a Harakiri, where you kick your own buckets. Gotta get past those YouTube censors. This one has Sub freeze himself, tip over, and explode all over the floor. Back to the story. Sub doesn't really do anything in Conquest mode besides train Shujinko for a little bit, so we can go back to where we left off. After laying Frost in the catacombs, Sub would try to get back to the other Earthrealm warriors trying to stop the Deadly Alliance. He would find out their fate after finding an injured Kenshi, as well as a new threat in Onaga. During this time, the two would be attacked by Hotaru, who would try to blind them. Working for Sub-Zero. As for Kenshi, after this, he would come across someone else, this time a friend, not foe, Serena, who claimed to know that not only Bi-Han was alive, but about his whereabouts as well. They would travel to the Netherrealm, finding Bi-Han along with Smoke, which sounds great for Kuai, I mean, his brother and best friend, but oh no. Bi-Han, now Noob Saibot, would attack Sub-Zero with the help of Smoke, nearly killing him, which he actually does in Noob Smoke's ending. But in canon, Serena converts to her demon form in order to save him. After waking up from this knuckle-induced nap, Kuai would attack Serena, thinking she was just a regular demon. He would find his way back to Earthrealm in the Lin Kuei Temple, where he would find Frost killing everyone. Somehow, and he would be forced to freeze her solid again and hide her away in the temple, hoping to one day find a way to save her from her current state, along with his brother and best friend. Deception is the best version of Kuai Liang Sub-Zero. No ifs, ands, or buts, he just is. Sure, his gameplay isn't the best, but Sub has never been the highest tier character, and it certainly doesn't matter as much compared to his awesome story and design. And I will give Deception Sub the first ever S tier ranking. Before we get into Mortal Kombat Armageddon, we can't forget the best MK spin-off game, Shaolin Monks. Sub-Zero gets one design in Shaolin Monks, shared both by Bi-Han in the opening cutscene and Kuai Liang in the actual game. This is my favorite Sub-Zero design. The armor, the colors, the mask, the icy arms, white eyes, the chainmail under armor, all of it just comes together so well, and it fits both Bi-Han and Kuai, which is pretty hard to do since they're so different. Gameplay includes all the classic moves from Sub, the Ice Blast, Ground Freeze, and Slide, basically a perfect recreation of his MK2 moveset into this new gameplay setting. Sub gets 3 fatalities in this game, the most we've seen up to this point. The first one is the Freeze Uppercut we've seen a couple times already. The second one is a recreation of his MK2 Freeze Ball Explosion fatality, which makes a little bit more sense now. And the third is the Spine Rip. All decent recreations, I'd say, but a little derivative and unoriginal. And then there's his Mortality, which takes out multiple opponents at once. His is kind of lame. He just stomps on the ground really hard and everyone just... Sub has a fairly small role in the story, showing up as Bi-Han in the opening cutscene of the Mortal Kombat tournament, where he battles Scorpion. After this cutscene, it's explained that Bi-Han bites the bullet just as he did in the original timeline. Later on, Sub-Zero shows up again while the titular Shaolin monks are traveling outworld to rescue Kitana. Here, they fight and Kung Lao slices Sub's face, giving him the iconic scar and also telling us that this is Kuai Liang. He explains that he is searching to avenge his brother, and he helps them find Kitana, taking them across the Sea of Blood. Scorpion shows up and he runs to chase after him. Later on, when Liu Kang and Kung Lao arrive in the Netherrealm, Sub can be seen fighting Noob Saibot, who quickly gets away. Sub explains that he thinks Noob is his brother who has been possessed by the Elder Gods. That's not how it usually is, but oh well, it's Shaolin Monks, so who really cares? He goes off to save his brother, and that's the last we see of Sub in the story. But after you beat the game, you can actually play through the campaign as Scorpion and Sub-Zero, with all their moves and abilities. But in cutscenes, they still talk like Liu Kang and Kung Lao, which is bizarre. Shaolin Monks Sub-Zero is great. Shaolin Monks did a great job in finding almost a definitive version of all these characters and everything besides story, which is lacking in general for the game, but everything else with Sub is great. I'll give him the same score as Scorpion, A-. And now we're at the game that ends off the legendary original Mortal Kombat timeline, almost unanimously seen as the best one. But it's time to say goodbye to the character, or I guess characters we've been following throughout this whole video, and get ready for a new era. But first, let's talk Armageddon. As with most of the characters, Sub does not get a new design in Armageddon, instead getting his Deadly Alliance alternate as his default, and his Deception default, or the Shredder design, as his alternate. Sub would only get one fighting stance, being Shotokan, usually his go-to in the other games, and then the weapon stance with the Kori blade. Gameplay-wise, finally, he doesn't suck. In fact, he's pretty damn good. He finally gets the sorely needed damage boost, and he has the best of everything when it comes to his moveset. He's finally back to being that perfect defensive keep-away character he was in MK4, having the best pokes in the game, and actually being able to set up his combos and punishes. Good on you, Sub-Zero. Give yourself a pat on the back. And also, none of the Armageddon characters had a unique fatality, instead having the creative fighter system, where you enter a bunch of inputs that would do random things like tearing limbs, breaking bones, stabbing them. Sounds kinda cool, but it was really lame. In Armageddon's Conquest mode, Sub is seen when Taven enters the Lin Kuei Temple. Seeing him as an intruder, which, I mean, yeah, he kinda was, Sub fights him and loses because he's not the main character. After this, the temple is invaded by Noob Saibot's army of Shadow Stalkers. Taven beats all of them up, along with Smoke, and then finds Noob, who has defeated Sub-Zero. Taven beats him up, again, main character, and Sub thanks him. He explains that he now has a chance to save his brother. He doesn't.
He is Noob Saibot, a warrior from the Netherrealm. He is my brother.
Your brother? Why did he try to kill you?
Says you! Sub is then later seen in the iconic Armageddon intro, battling on the side of the Order of Light. The last we see of him before MK9 is him being blasted off the pyramid by Shang Tsung's Skull Blast. And that'll do it for both brothers. Noob does die during the Battle of Armageddon, but I may or may not do a Beyond the Krypt for him in the future. The story of Sub-Zero, and especially his final fate, may not be as tragic or poetic as Scorpion's, but this character is still up there with one of the best narratives in the series. I think Sub has the best set of relationships and conflicts within those relationships of any character in the series. You got Frost, you got Scorpion, you got Serena, you got Bi-Han, and even the more minor ones like Raiden and Kenshi. I'll also talk about Sub's ladder ending here. From this point on, all the ladder endings up until MK1 are not canon, so I thought I'd start mentioning them more here, since before I would have just mentioned them anyway, since they are canon and just a part of the story. In Sub's ending, the power of Blaze along with the Dragon Medallion gives him the power of a god. But apparently you need consent from the Elder Gods in order to become a god, so they send their champions to kill him. Armageddon Sub-Zero is a great wrapping of the bow on top of this fantastic character, definitely one of my favorites, and this version of him is also one of my favorites, right up there with Deception, and I'm gonna give Armageddon Sub-Zero another S. Before Warner Bros. Acquired the rights to Mortal Kombat, which seems like a worse and worse decision by the day, Midway gave us one last addition to the Mortal Kombat franchise with Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, another next-gen game with a huge graphical leap. Sub-Zero's design in this game is, like Scorpion's, a nice blend of what we had in the past and what was to come. When I look at it, I see this costume as a fusion of his Shaolin Monks design, especially from the neck down, and then the ice arms, blue eyes, and scar are taken from his Deadly Alliance ult, and then the mask and character model are clearly from MK9, or MK9 is from this game technically. While it was still a 3D game, MK vs. DC was a bit of a transitional phase to the 2D gameplay we have today. This definitely made it feel a bit awkward and less smooth than the 3D era games or the NRS era games, kinda like MK4. Competitively, Sub was around the same level as Scorpion, being solid. He had good jab pressure, some good wall combos, and with his new moves, the Ice Nugget, which isn't that great to be honest, but his other two new moves, the Ice Counter and the Teleport, yes, that's right, Sub with a teleport, gave a lot of great tools to his kit this time around, though his mix-ups weren't the best and he could be zoned out pretty bad from full screen, even with his teleport. And MK vs. DC would of course be infamous for being the first and only game in the series to be rated anything less than an M for Mature, being rated T for Teen by the ESRB, which Sub-Zero kinda created. With DC characters coming in, the game had to tone it down since superheroes in general back then were seen for less mature audiences. DC would not allow for Superman to get his heart ripped out by Kano, of all people. So instead we get this. Sub's fatals weren't too impacted by this since he was never the most gory character with the exception of his first finisher, so he gets a fatality where he freezes the opponent and then kicks them and they shatter, and then basically the same thing where instead of kicking them, he picks them up and slams them. MK vs. DC isn't canon to the Mortal Kombat story, but it had a pretty interesting setup. It takes place after MK2 with the timelines merging due to Shao Kahn and Darkseid being pushed into portals simultaneously. And this was the first cinematic story Mortal Kombat would have in the structure we know today, with the chapters focusing on individual characters. It would also be the first MK game to have big budget voice actors, with Sub-Zero being voiced by Jim Miller. No, not that Jim Miller. He's actually super underrated since most people just remember Steve Blum, who's a legend, but I really like the voice Jim brings to Sub in this game and MK9. Sub is first seen in the story mode during Liu Kang's chapter in a cemetery. Liu Kang thinks Sub, who is Kuai Liang, and the Lin Kuei may have been responsible for the disappearances of some of the White Lotus members. After fighting, Sub reveals that some of his Lin Kuei have also disappeared, but Scorpion appears, hunting Sub-Zero, and Liu Kang defeats him. Chronologically, the next thing Sub-Zero does is have a run-in with Superman and he freezes him solid. But the battle takes a lot out of him and Wonder Woman arrives and takes him out, also capturing him. He's freed by Jax and Sonya, who send him to find Scorpion, who could then lead them to Quan Chi. This leads into Sub's own chapter where he arrives at Raiden's temple, but Raiden doesn't trust him, so they fight. Sub beats some sense into him, and Raiden helps him find Scorpion in Gotham. When he gets there, Sub is attacked by Deathstroke and beats him up, before then just stumbling upon the Batcave. I don't think you're just supposed to be able to do that, but to be fair, Sub is an assassin. He fights Batman and wins because he didn't have any prep time, and then gets pulled into the Netherrealm by Scorpion himself. They fight, allowing Quan Chi to escape. After this point, the MK characters, despite their own inner conflicts, conclude that they need to team up to counter these new intruders on their world, which means Sub and Scorp are now best buds, and they find themselves at the Shaolin Temple. Sub fights Lex Luthor and loses, and that's kind of the last major appearance he has. He shows up at the final battle along with everyone else, and when Dark Khan is defeated, they all go back to their worlds, and it's happily ever after for this timeline that we will never see again. In his ending, he becomes Batman. And that'll do it for MK vs. DC Sub-Zero. His story is kinda lame, but everything else about him is solid, especially his design. I'll give MK vs. DC Sub a B-. Now we dive into the game that changed everything. Quite possibly the most influential fighting game of the 21st century, the 2011 reboot of Mortal Kombat titled Mortal Kombat, or Mortal Kombat 9 to the community. This game was a return to form, bringing back 2D combat with improved modern graphics and every single classic era character coming back, of course including Sub-Zero. His base design took the MK vs. DC one and dialed it back a bit to be a more simple ninja design, getting rid of the ice arms, blue eyes, and the scar entirely for the first time since MK2. And a lot of the exaggerated armor pieces as well. Even though I love all those details from the MK vs. DC design, I can appreciate and enjoy this simplified take, especially since Scorpion in this game was dialed up to 12 and none of the other ninjas really had that simple look to them, so I think this was welcome considering the context. Sub's alternate is meant to be Bi-Han, and this one, it's a bit too simple and I don't really think it shows a big difference between Bi-Han and his brother, and it's really just unnoteworthy, though it is the base for how his Noob Saibot design would look later on, and it looks much better there. In this skin, he is voiced by Jameson Price, who is also Noob Saibot and the announcer. I really like his Bi-Han voice, especially when he's Noob Saibot. We also get a classic design taken from the first game, and the unmasked sub from MK3, though this recreation isn't at all accurate as it's just the UMK3 classic ninja design without the mask, and not the original Sub-Zero from base MK3. And it doesn't stop there, since we also have Cyber Sub-Zero. This is of course his first appearance, replacing Cyber Smoke, and his design is pretty great in my opinion since they went back to the roots of the Cyber Ninja inspiration and made a very Predator-like design with the clean color palette of blue, gray, and white. Cyber Sub would also get a classic Cyber Ninja design, however this one doesn't really do it for me and the color is just way too dark compared to the vibrance of the actual classic Cyber Ninjas. As for gameplay, Human Sub was a mid to low tier character. Once again, his ice clone was a good defensive weapon, giving him a lot of safety when using it after combos. However, his offense still wasn't effective enough, particularly his normals were slow and terrible, and he had a very low level mix-up game, and as always, he hit about as hard as Devin Haney. As with MK vs. DC, zoning, which was a very big strength of the top level characters, was a major weakness for Sub, especially since he no longer had the teleport. His hitbox was also big, meaning strings that wouldn't hit some characters would hit him, meaning he could also struggle with built-up pressure. But then there's Cyber Sub-Zero, who was the first character NRS built from the ground up when it came to gameplay without using influence from past games since he didn't exist in those past games. He was a blend of the Cyber Ninja moveset along with the traditional Sub-Zero moveset. He had great versatility and mobility, and his damage was a big improvement over Human Sub. He had a lot of interesting new moves like his Ice Parry and Ice Bombs, and some moves taken from other characters like the traditional Ice Ball and Cyrax's Teleport. In fact, Cyber Sub was very nearly just a Cyrax reskin, with his Ice Ball being similar to the net, having the Teleport, and the only thing that really set him apart and made him much worse were the bombs and the bomb setups. The Ice Bombs were just not reliable at all. Freezing the opponent was not as powerful as launching them, sometimes they wouldn't even freeze them at all, and sometimes they wouldn't even come out. Overall though, Cyber Sub was a much more fun, experimental, and interesting character than his human counterpart. But as with his bombs, a lot of his toolkit was just not reliable enough against the best MK9 had to offer. Though he had some good counter zoning, unlike his human form, he'd still get chewed up and punished in other departments, making him still a mid to low tier character. In MK9, every character got a super move in the form of an X-ray. Sub's was decent. Remember, this was the first time they appeared, so they weren't going to be spectacular. In his, he freezes an ice ball against the opponent's stomach, and then shatters it, and then he headbutts them. Cyber Sub had an X-ray you had to do in the air, making him dive into the opponent, slam an ice ball in the back of their head, and then stab him in the back with the Quarry Blade. Sub and Cyber Sub collectively have 7 finishing moves. Sub firstly has a fatality where he freezes the legs and then rips their torso from the bottom half of their body, then one where he rips out their spine and skull, freezes them, and then uses their head and spine to shatter their body. Then there's his classic fatality where he does the classic spine rip from MK1, his babality where he turns to a baby, pees on the floor, it freezes beneath him, and he slips on it. As for Cyber Sub, he has a fatality where he fires these shurikens into the opponent's body, the last one going into their brain and making them strike a pose. His second one has him jump onto the opponent, freeze himself and them, and then explode, leaving them as just legs, but also sacrificing himself in the process. Are all these cyber ninjas just depressed or something? What's going on with them? Then there's his babality, which is actually kind of sad. He plays with the ice bomb and then freezes himself, leaving poor baby Cyber Sub to cry in a block of ice. Alright, let's talk about the story mode. MK9 is an in-continuity reboot, so it kicks off right where Armageddon left off, and it shows that Sub-Zero did die along with everybody else, but evidence shows that Sub died to Baraka. That's lame. Raiden and Shao Kahn are the last two combatants standing, but Raiden sends a message back in time to himself during the first Mortal Kombat tournament. This means everything from before that tournament, including Sub-Zero Mythologies and other events stated to be before that game, should be canon. Keyword is should be. That's 2 words, but key 2 words, should be. Sub's bio in MK9 reveals the two brothers' names for the first time. Bi-Han, the older brother, and Kuai Liang, the younger brother. Though that's hardly a reveal for you guys since I've been saying their names the whole video. It's also revealed that Kuai Liang's codename before taking the mantle of Sub-Zero was Tundra. You remember that? Sub first shows up as Bi-Han in the first chapter in the background. He appears again in chapter 2 working for Shang Tsung, which definitely isn't how it was before, but remember, key 2 words is should be. Sub gets bodied by Sonya of all people, and next shows up to fight Scorpion in the Netherrealm. He gets cooked. Literally. After that, Kuai Liang then appears for the first time in Smoke's chapter, chapter 7. It's shown that they are both on the run from the Lin Kuei cyber initiative and searching for Bi-Han's killer in Outworld, which is a much bigger motivation for Kuai Liang this time around compared to the original timeline. I like this since it's a reflection of history repeating itself, with Scorpion getting his revenge on Bi-Han, and then Kuai Liang wanting to get his revenge on Scorpion for killing Bi-Han. He then appears in the very next chapter, which is his own. He's freezing some poor guy in the Soul Chamber. Then Cyrax shows up, now cyberized, to do the same to him. Sub beats him and is met by Jax and Sonya. He learns from them that Scorpion killed Sub-Zero and that he could find him at the Coliseum. Ermac gets grumpy because they woke him up from his nap, so he explodes Jax's arms and fights Sub, but loses. Sub runs away without helping because of revenge and stuff. He arrives at the Coliseum and fights Reptile to pad the fight count, and then fights Scorpion, beating him as well. He is about to finish him, but is interrupted by the Cyber Lin Kuei, who take him away, despite the fact that Raiden 100% could have saved him, but chose not to for some reason. Then, at the end of Cabal's chapter, chapter 13, he shows up for the first time in his cyberized form, brainwashed by the Lin Kuei. He's beaten by Cabal and taken to the church where the Earthrealm defenders have gathered. There, he's saved from his Lin Kuei coding and sent in as an undercover agent into Outworld. He's quickly found out by Sector, but beats him. He then discovers the group of Earthrealm soldiers being used to feed the Solnado, and saves them by defeating both Goro and Kentaro at the same time. Wait, what? Then he also fights Ermac and arrives just in time for the Solnado to be created in all of its glory. It's here where the greatest interaction between two characters in Mortal Kombat history takes place.
The one Kano warned about. He is mine. You are not worthy of the name Sub-Zero.
Who are you to judge?
I wore those colors before you.
Bi-Han?
Yes, Kuai Liang. It is I. Quan Chi restored me.
Restored. You and I both. We are flawed copies of our former selves.
I have no flaws. Quan Chi has perfected me.
For what end? To serve the Netherrealm and Outworld?
It suits my purpose.
But brother,
We share blood. We are not brothers.
then I will not regret your defeat.
Cyber Sub would then have to leave or else he'd get his soul ripped apart by the Solnado. After the Solnado is destroyed, the Earthrealmers would get ambushed by the Cyber Lin Kuei, who they are able to defeat. But then a brainwashed and powered up Sindel arrives and kills everyone, including Sub-Zero. How? He just gets punched a few times. Damn, what a pathetic way to go out. We see him one last time in the Netherrealm, now resurrected by Quan Chi as a Revenant. And while some of the Revenants fight Raiden, Cyber Sub is not one of them. Sub's story in MK9 is a little weird because it's a great setup and evolution of his story from MK1 to 3, and even his cyberization is a great way to mix things up, but they don't really take advantage of that or do anything interesting with him, and he comes across kind of boring in this game. In his ending, Sub learns from Raiden about the Lin Kuei's past of murdering innocents, including his and Scorpion's family, and so he creates an alliance. A deadly alliance, with Scorpion beating their enemies and then disappearing into legend. MK9 Sub-Zero is mediocre. His design is really good, but not much else stands out about him, other than the awesome concept that is Cyber Sub, but in execution, he needed a lot more ironing out. I'll give MK9 Sub-Zero a C-. Now let's dive into the next NetherRealm Mortal Kombat game, Mortal Kombat X. And remember, the MKX comics are not canon, so they do not count in any way towards this Sub-Zero's final grade. Firstly, the design. I know a lot of people love this one, and there are versions of it that don't look too bad like in the first Legends movie, but in this game specifically, I am not a fan. The Marty McFly puffer jacket look is weird to me, and I hate the lack of any pure black. It's all gray. Even the mask is this ugly gray color instead of blue, or even silver wouldn't look awful. The best thing about it is the blue that they chose, which is only because in comparison to most of the other colors in MKX, it's not completely dreary and desaturated. He also gets a Grandmaster design, which is basically his Deadly Alliance default, but better since he's not old, and the beard does a lot to make him look cool while still giving that old, wise type of edge to him. Some of his other costumes include a Revenant design, now uncyberized for a reason you can only find out in the supposedly non-canon MKX comics, a Cold War design, a classic UMK3 design, and the Cold Steel action figure design. Cyber Sub-Zero would also return in the form of Triborg, and this design sucks. The nice shade of blue and gray he had is now completely ruined and made dark and desaturated for no reason. Mortal Kombat X introduced variations, 3 different versions of a character that each had unique gameplay abilities. For a lot of characters, this completely changed their placement on a tier list based on which variation they were. For Sub-Zero, none of his variations are particularly strong, but all of them are somewhat viable. First up, we have Cryomancer. This is the combo / rushdown variation, and for a lot of people, the most fun variation Sub has. This is by far Sub's most damaging variation, and is particularly good with aggression in the corner. Most of the new additions to his toolkit are in the form of strings that utilize ice weapons, and a new special with the Frost Hammer. His uppercut is now much better with more range since he uses his ice sword instead of his fist, and he also has a lot of 50-50 potential, as with most characters in MKX since this was the 50-50 game. Next there's Grandmaster, which is his best variation because, say it with me now, the Ice Clone, and they've amped up the creativity he has with these clones, really being able to trap opponents in these lose-lose situations. He could throw the clone will take projectiles for him, he could use the new Ice Burst move on the clone which would explode into the opponent. It's kind of nuts how much you can really do with it, along with the base function it's had since MK3. There are some matchups though that made this variation a lot less effective, especially characters that can teleport. Plus, his damage is a lot less than what you get from Cryomancer, but still a solid variation that blends offense and defense very well. And finally, we've talked about an offensive variation, we've talked about one that blends offense and defense. Now for the solely defensive variation, Unbreakable. This one gives him an icy aura that gets rid of block damage, gives him some damage buffs, and allows him to extend combos. Sometimes you have to be really good with the timing, and it could be countered. But if the opponent hoped to counter, you also had the Barrier of Ice, which was an ice shield that froze the opponent when they hit it, but it could be countered by jump-ins and had a long recovery time. So there are some pros and cons to this variation that kind of just cancel each other out. The other 2 variations are much more effective in what they want to do, making this one kind of useless and generally one of the worst variations in the game. Then there's Cyber Sub, who is a secret 4th variation for Triborg, so not really meant to be taken too seriously, but he's actually really fun. A lot of his moves are just taken from MK9, but generally, Triborg's base moveset and Cyber Sub's toolkit in general was a lot more beneficial to these moves than his MK9 form, and he still had the great mobility of that version of the character. The biggest new addition were the drones. You could summon up to 3 and they would buff some of your ice moves, doing different things for all of them, almost like another EX. However, a lot of his moves were very unsafe and relied a lot on unpredictability. Once he gets figured out, he becomes a lot less powerful. In his X-Ray, Sub grabs the opponent's liver, I think, and crushes it before shoving a giant ice spike through their eye. That person is dead. Sub gets 3 fatalities in Mortal Kombat X, plus a bunch of brutalities that would take forever to cover. His first one has him freeze the opponent's chest, shatter it, grab their spine, raise them over his head, and rip them in half. His second has him kick them onto a bed of ice spikes and stomp on them so that the spikes shove through their head, poking out their eye. His final fatality is the classic spine rip from the classic fatality pack. As for the story mode, Sub is first seen in the opening chapter, which takes place soon after MK9, with Shinnok launching his attack on Earthrealm. Sub, with the help of Scorpion, ambushes the special forces on their chopper, causing it to crash. In the rubble, Sub fights Johnny Cage and loses. Later, we see Sub again while Johnny and Sonya are investigating Quan Chi's fortress. During the battle, the souls of Sub-Zero and the other Revenant, Jax, and the Spectre, Scorpion, are freed. Sometime after this, Sub-Zero takes down Sector and discovers the truth that the Lin Kuei and Quan Chi were in fact responsible for the deaths of Scorpion's family, making them also indirectly responsible for the fate of Bi-Han as well. Sub-Zero decides to restart the Lin Kuei as Earthrealm's protectors, taking on a pupil in Frost. I wonder how that'll turn out. As the Grandmaster of the Lin Kuei, Kuai makes an effort to make peace with Hanzo, telling him the truth about the Shiraiyu massacre. I also shouldn't forget to mention that Sub is now voiced by Steve Blum, who is more known for the rough and tough characters or monster characters, but he does a really good job as the more subdued Sub-Zero. In the present day events of the game, 5 years after that interaction, Sub-Zero is in good faith with the Special Forces and agrees to help them test their team of fighters, the Kombat Kids, to see if they are ready for the big missions that lie ahead. He beats them all up. Sub then isn't really seen until near the end of the game when the Kombat Kids need to be saved from Kotal's forces after Shinnok has tainted Earthrealm's Jinsei. And that's kinda it. Kuai Liang doesn't really do anything in this story besides be sort of a mentor figure to the Kombat Kids. Most of the interesting stuff he does is off screen. In his arcade ladder ending, Sub-Zero just decides to become a dragon tamer. Okay. NRS's writing team must have been feeling really creative that day. MKX Sub isn't great. It feels like we've really taken a nosedive since the 3D era. Deception and Armageddon were the peaks of this character, and it's only been disappointment since. I'll give MKX Sub a D. Now we're at one of, if not the most controversial MK game, Mortal Kombat 11. Let's go. First off, his design is a big improvement. I know people don't like the pirate hat looking thing on his head, which I think is supposed to be some sort of Chinese hood, and I don't like it either, but it's more than made up for by the colors and layout of this outfit, which is just a massive step up from MKX, with the nice armor, including the Lin Kuei symbols on his arms, and the blue, black, and white color scheme, which is very nice. MK11 introduced the gear system, and I cannot go through everything, but most of his masks from the previous games do return, such as the MKX mask, the Deadly Alliance one, the Deception one, and obviously the MK2 mask, speaking of which he also gets a classic MK2 skin. Along with that, he gets the Deception design, and a Dimitri Vegas skin.
It's like looking in a mirror.
When it comes to gameplay, MK11 has custom variations, making tier listing a bit odd since you can kind of fluctuate up and down the tier list based on the certain playstyle you have with the certain moves you have equipped. Generally, Sub was a just outside the top tier character, especially with all the different mix and matches you could do with the custom variations. One of his moves was even just straight up banned in tournament play, which was the ground freeze. But Sub had a lot of safety, once again being a great defensive character, even taking some of that counter zoning techniques from Cyber Sub. His mix-ups were good, his Rising Ice move was really good, and he was a really good starter, well-rounded character. But one notable thing that's missing is the Ice clone, and I know a lot of people were very disappointed that it didn't make its return in this game, and I honestly think it should have, maybe as a 2 or even 3 slot custom variation move. In his Fatal Blow, the new super move introduced in MK11, he chops at the opponent's sides with ice axes, slams a giant ice axe into them, and then lifts them up and slams them. Let's get to the fatalities. His first fatality has him freeze the opponent's body in an ice cube, and then chop off their head with an ice axe. He grabs the head, freezes it, and shatters it. His second fatality has him create an ice clone, which has a spear, and then he slides into the opponent, making them fall onto the spear, then rips out their spine and slams their head onto the spear. He also gets a friendship where he serves some ice cream from an ice cream station freezer thing. It's really cute. In MK11, the past and present are colliding. However, Sub is one of the few characters in the game to not have a past version of himself. There was planned to be one, he has his own official design in the game, but it was never included in the story, and I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity because it could have been interesting to see these two different versions of Kuai Liang in two different points in time, interact with each other, and maybe even reintroduce Cyber Sub-Zero, but no. We first see Sub in Chapter 4 with Hanzo at the Lin Kuei Cyber Facility, which has returned due to the time merger where many of Sub's Lin Kuei have been killed. Even worse, his prized pupil, Frost, has turned against him and become a cyborg. But not like the other cyborgs, no. This is a woman, so she needs curves and hair. Sub helps Cyrax, destroying his inhibitor chip, who then helps them take down the Cyber Lin Kuei and Sector. For now. Later on, the Earthrealmers find shelter at the Shirai-Ryu Fire Garden, and Kuai Liang is sent along with Hanzo to find Charon in the Netherrealm, who has a ship that can take them to Kronika's Keep. After finding Charon, Hanzo convinces Kuai to notify Raiden, so he goes back to Earthrealm. But the Scorpion that returns is not Hanzo, but the past version of Scorpion, who notifies them of Hanzo's death, and nobody cares. Kuai attacks the Scorpion and loses. He's later seen during the final battle, helping Raiden figure out that Frost is in charge of the Cyber Lin Kuei. And that's the last we see of him in the main story. He appears very briefly during Aftermath, fighting against Fujin and Shang Tsung, not trusting them, but other than that, that's it. In his latter ending, after defeating Kronika, Kuai uses her power to save his brother from his fate of becoming Noob Saibot, and they live happily ever after as co-grandmasters of the Lin Kuei. Brings a tear to my eye. Overall, Sub in MK11 is an improvement when it comes to design and gameplay. His story though is still so bland and just nothing. I'll give MK11 Sub-Zero a C+. And here we are, the end, the latest Mortal Kombat game, MK1. So let's finish our retrospective on Sub-Zero. First things first, Bi-Han is back as the main Sub-Zero, and his design is very simple, a nice refresher from the more complicated over-designed stuff from the later games. MK1 offers a ton of skin options. Some of the best ones are the MK 1995 movie skin, the Deadly Alliance alternate, the UMK3 design, and oh my god, what is that? Now onto the gameplay. Mortal Kombat 1 is still evolving, but as of right now, Sub-Zero isn't that great, which I feel like is the average for his character. A lot of the moves that used to be really useful now have some big downsides this time around, such as long startup times, especially with the Ice Ball, which is so slow now, and used to be his main anti-zoning tool, making him a lot worse at range. His Ice Clone is a lot worse now, with a long cooldown, though it did get buffed recently. They were pretty much useless before. His damage is once again not great, and his worst issues are tons of gaps in his most basic strings, and the fact that he has no truly great synergy with any of the cameos. His Fatal Blow has him summon ice spikes to stab the opponent, and then come down with a big ice hammer. Sub's got two fatalities. The first one has him slice the opponent in half with an ice shard, kick their torso around, just in time for the shard to come back and slice into their head. His second has him slam the opponent's face into an ice wall until their brain falls out, and then he freezes them and shatters them onto the wall of ice. And then there's his Animality, where he turns into a woolly mammoth, throws the opponent up onto its tusks, and then uses its trunk to rip them in half. Now let's talk about Cameo Sub. He's really good, one of the go-tos for a lot of people, because he's very effective in neutralizing keep away tactics. He's also got his own fatality, which is just the classic spine rip. Story-wise, Bi-Han is now the Grandmaster of the Lin Kuei after his father died in a completely unpreventable way, I'm sure. The story kicks off with the Lin Kuei ambushing Kung Lao and Raiden, but it's just a test by Liu Kang to see if they're worthy of entering the tournament. In this timeline, the Lin Kuei are Earthrealm's protectors and work under Liu Kang, which Bi-Han is not too happy about, believing the Lin Kuei are meant to take what's theirs and be a dominant force in Earthrealm. Bi-Han, Kuai, the new Scorpion, and their adopted brother Smoke are sent on a mission to the Ying Fortress to destroy Shang Tsung's Soul Stealers. Along the way, they get into an argument about whether the Lin Kuei should rule Earthrealm or be its protectors. Bi-Han then absolutely roasts Smoke.
Fatherless child detected.
They infiltrate the fortress, defeating Natara and Ermac, and eventually face off against the Deadly Alliance, Shang Tsung and Quan Chi, who've teamed up with General Shao. Shang Tsung manages to convince Bi-Han to join their efforts to restore the Dragon Army, promising power, freedom from Liu Kang, and control of said army. Bi-Han not only agrees to this, but reveals that he let their father die so he could take control of the Lin Kuei, because he believed he was a fool who didn't see the potential and power of the Lin Kuei. Yeah, I hate this character. Kuai manages to escape the fortress, but Bi-Han confronts him outside, even giving him the iconic scar. But in the end, he loses. And that's the last we see of him in the main story, unless you pick him to beat the Deadly Alliance at the end of the game. In his ending, he begins the Lin Kuei Cyber Initiative, or what appears to be a cyber initiative at the time, in order to create a stronger Lin Kuei army. But then, there's chaos reigns. At the beginning, Sub trains Cyrax and Sector. Instead of a cyber initiative, instead the Lin Kuei are put into suits of armor similar to Iron Man, giving them the free will and instincts of a human, while also giving them the powers of a cyborg. Sub gets them ready to invade Kuai Liang's wedding, which they do, but are unsuccessful, being captured and brought before Melina in Outworld. But before justice is served, Titan Havoc arrives and Bi-Han is free so he can assist in the battle. He then stupidly jumps into a portal as Titan Havoc escapes, leaving him to be captured and turned into Noob Saibot. Finally, there was an invasion season based around Sub where a Titan Sub-Zero invades the main timeline, trying to cover the world in ice and take over everything, but he is defeated. If you play invasions, which most people don't, so I guess he wins and everyone dies. So, our final grade for MK1 Sub-Zero. I've waited a long time for this. F. This Sub-Zero sucks. His gameplay is frustratingly held back compared to previous subs. The design is okay, but his story is garbage. This is not Bi-Han and a terrible representation that has done irreparable damage to his perception. Screw MK1, and no, I do not care about ending on a positive note. And that's it. We've covered every single version of Sub-Zero from the original Mortal Kombat in 1992 all the way up to Mortal Kombat 1. You guys let me know what I did well, what I can improve on, and all that stuff in the comments down below. And while you're down there, make sure to check out the links in the description to my merch store, Twitter, and Instagram. Also, make sure to give this video a like to show your support, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to know when I next upload. And with that being said, that's it for this video, my fellow oddities. I'll see you next time.